Thanksgiving was a cherished tradition in our home, one that my husband and I took pride in hosting every year. This time, we decided to go all out, preparing a feast that could feed an army. The planning began weeks in advance, from grocery lists meticulously crafted to early morning trips to the farmer's market. Our kitchen buzzed with activity for days leading up to the celebration, filled with the aroma of roasting turkeys and freshly baked rolls. On the big day, the dining table was laden with dishes that epitomized Thanksgiving indulgence: 2 perfectly roasted turkeys, a honey-glazed ham, fluffy mounds of mashed potatoes, pans of golden brown dressing, and a sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows. My husband and I were exhausted but proud as we placed the last dish on the table, knowing we had created a meal to remember. The in-laws arrived in their usual fashion, arms overflowing with desserts that could rival any bakery's display case. Pies of every variety, trays of cookies, and perfectly baked rolls made their way to the dessert table. These contributions were not only delicious, but also helped lighten our workload, a gesture I deeply appreciated. The evening was lively, with laughter echoing through the house and clinking glasses marking toasts to family and togetherness. The effort of hosting felt worth it as everyone enjoyed the fruits of our labor. Conversations ranged from playful teasing to heartfelt moments of gratitude, creating the warm and welcoming atmosphere we always envisioned. As the night wore on, my husband brought out the stack of plastic containers we'd prepared for leftovers. "Help yourselves," he told everyone with a smile, gesturing toward the spread that still covered the table and kitchen island. It felt good to know that our family would enjoy these flavors, even after the holiday had ended. With that, we retired to the living room, ready to relax after the long but fulfilling day of hosting. While I put my feet up and listened to the chatter around me, the warm glow of the evening lingered, leaving no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. The living room was alive with the hum of conversation and laughter. As I sank into the couch, I allowed myself a rare moment of relaxation, savoring the sense of accomplishment. The day had been a success, family gathered, appetites satisfied, and the air filled with the unmistakable warmth of the holidays. My husband handed me a glass of wine and we shared a quick, knowing smile. Hosting Thanksgiving was exhausting, but seeing everyone enjoy themselves made it worthwhile. Guests filtered in and out of the kitchen, filling the leftover containers we had provided. It felt natural and generous to share the abundance of food we had prepared. The thought that anyone might take more than their fair share didn't even cross my mind. Thanksgiving was about giving, after all, and seeing our family relish the meal we'd worked so hard to create brought genuine joy. The children played noisily in the background while the adults swapped stories and teased each other in the way only family can. Plates of pie and cookies made their rounds as people indulged in one last bite of dessert. My husband and I stayed in the living room, too tired to check on the kitchen, but trusting that everything was under control. As the evening wound down, we began the ritual of saying goodbyes, walking guests to their cars, and exchanging promises to get together again soon. My in-laws offered their usual heartfelt thanks, expressing how much they looked forward to our holiday gatherings. The sight of everyone leaving happy, with leftovers in hand, felt like the perfect conclusion to the day. When the last car drove off, I was too drained to do anything but collapse into bed. The fridge was stocked, and tomorrow promised the indulgent comfort of leftovers, something I was already looking forward to. The next morning greeted me with the soft light of a lazy holiday weekend. Still basking in the success of the previous evening, I wandered into the kitchen, eager to relive the indulgence of Thanksgiving. My mouth watered at the thought of turkey sandwiches, creamy mashed potatoes smothered in gravy, and the unmistakable sweetness of leftover pie. As I opened the fridge, my heart sank. The shelves were shockingly bare. A single bag of turkey wings sat forlornly in the corner, accompanied by half a bag of dressing. For a moment, I stared, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I stored the leftovers somewhere else? The thought seemed absurd, but I hurried to check the garage fridge, hoping against hope that I was mistaken. The garage fridge offered no comfort. It was as empty as the one inside. Panic began to creep in, my earlier excitement replaced by confusion and frustration. 20 pounds of mashed potatoes, 2 pans of dressing, sweet potato casserole, 2 turkeys, a ham. Gone. Even the desserts the in-laws had brought were nowhere to be found. I slumped at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of the situation. My mind clung to rational explanations. Had there been a miscommunication? Could someone have taken the food to donate to a charity? The thought was improbable, but not impossible. When my husband entered the room, I turned to him with disbelief etched across my face. "What happened to all the food?" I asked, hoping he'd have an answer that would dissolve my growing frustration. His expression turned serious as he explained what he had seen the night before. As his words unfolded, my confusion turned to shock, and then to anger. My husband leaned against the counter, clearly uneasy as he began to explain. "I noticed something last night," he started cautiously. "While we were in the living room, I saw one of your relatives, along with their entire family, making multiple trips to their car with bags of food." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Bags of food?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Not just food," he continued. "I'm talking gallon-sized Ziploc bags, containers, even some of the desserts your in-laws brought. They were packing everything: turkey, potatoes, casseroles, you name it." The image of our lovingly prepared feast being carted off like loot from a raid sent a wave of frustration through me. "You're saying they took all of it?" I asked, my voice rising. He nodded, looking equally incredulous. "I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured they were just being enthusiastic about leftovers. But now, seeing the fridge," he gestured at its empty shelves. "Yeah, it looks like they cleaned us out." I struggled to contain my emotions. Anger bubbled up, but it was laced with a deep sense of betrayal. We had hosted with open arms, spent days cooking, and invited everyone to enjoy the holiday in our home. Sharing leftovers was part of that generosity, but this felt different. It wasn't just about food. It was about respect, or the lack thereof. "They even took unopened desserts?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he confirmed grimly. "Everything they brought, plus most of what we made. It was like they came prepared to raid the entire kitchen." I sat back, stunned. Memories of the previous evening replayed in my mind, each cheerful goodbye now tainted by the knowledge of what had happened. I had willingly offered leftovers, trusting my family to show the same decency we extended to them. Instead, they had taken advantage, leaving us with scraps. This was no misunderstanding. It was outright greed. I sat in silence, letting my husband's words sink in. My initial shock gave way to a flood of emotions: frustration, hurt, disbelief. This wasn't just about food. It was the principle of the matter. I had poured my time, energy, and heart into creating a meal that brought the family together. Sharing leftovers was supposed to be a generous gesture, not an invitation to empty the fridge entirely. I turned to my husband, hoping for some clarity. "Do you think they misunderstood? Maybe they thought we didn't want any of the leftovers." He shook his head. "That's not how it came across. I specifically told everyone to help themselves to some leftovers, not to clean us out. And who takes unopened desserts? That wasn't even part of the offer." His frustration mirrored my own. The more I thought about it, the more deliberate it all seemed. Gallon bags, multiple trips to the car. This wasn't a case of miscommunication or overzealous generosity. They had come prepared to take as much as possible, leaving nothing for the hosts who had provided everything in the first place. I replayed the evening in my mind, trying to remember if anyone had said or done anything that hinted at their intentions. Nothing stood out. Everyone had seemed so cheerful and grateful, thanking us repeatedly for hosting. The realization that this gratitude had been accompanied by such blatant disregard felt like a punch to the gut. "What do we even do about this?" I asked, more to myself than to him. The idea of confronting the relatives felt uncomfortable, but so did letting it slide. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a breach of trust that tainted the entire evening. For now, all I could do was sit with the disappointment. The warm glow of Thanksgiving had vanished, replaced by a cold emptiness that matched the fridge. As the morning dragged on, I found myself unable to shake the heaviness of what had happened. The food itself was one thing, though I couldn't help but think about the sheer volume that had been taken. 20 pounds of mashed potatoes, enough dressing to fill 2 large pans, 2 roasted turkeys, a ham, and trays of desserts. The scale of it all was staggering. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the empty counter where the leftovers should have been. Just yesterday, it had been the centerpiece of a celebration, piled high with dishes that represented days of effort. Now, it was bare, a stark reminder of how quickly everything had been taken. I tried to calculate how much time, energy, and money had gone into preparing that meal. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't just the food that hurt, it was the principle. Cooking for Thanksgiving had been a labor of love, a way of showing care and appreciation for our family. Sharing leftovers had been part of that generosity, a token to extend the holiday joy. But what had happened wasn't sharing. It was taking. It felt like our efforts had been reduced to a free-for-all, a chance for others to take advantage without a second thought. As I thought about the desserts my in-laws had contributed, a fresh wave of frustration hit me. Those desserts weren't mine to give away, yet they had disappeared along with everything else. Even the unopened trays, carefully baked and brought to share, had been swept up in the frenzy. I felt drained, not just from the physical work of hosting, but from the emotional toll of seeing it all vanish so ungratefully. It wasn't just food that had been taken. It was the joy, pride, and trust that made hosting worthwhile. Hospitality has always been a cornerstone of our holiday gatherings. It wasn't just about opening our home. It was about creating an environment where everyone felt welcomed, cared for, and valued. Thanksgiving had always been my way of expressing love through food, ensuring that no one left hungry or empty-handed. Yet, as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the void where our feast had once been, I couldn't help but feel that this bond of hospitality had been shattered. I had willingly shared what we had, expecting that my gesture would be met with respect and moderation. Leftovers were a tradition in themselves, a way of letting everyone take a piece of the holiday with them. But this wasn't tradition. It was greed. The sight of the empty fridge wasn't just a physical absence of food. It was a glaring reminder of how my generosity had been taken advantage of. What stung the most was the sense of betrayal. These were family members, people we trusted to honor the spirit of the holiday. Instead, they had turned it into an opportunity to strip us of everything we had prepared. I thought about the meticulous planning, the hours spent peeling potatoes, basting turkeys, and perfecting recipes. It was all meant to bring us closer together, to celebrate what we had as a family. But their actions had driven a wedge into that unity. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned myself. Had I been too naive, too trusting? Part of me felt foolish for not anticipating something like this. But then, who expects their own family to behave this way? Hospitality is built on trust, and theirs had turned out to be one-sided. The idea of hosting another holiday felt almost unbearable. How could I open my home again, knowing that such disrespect was possible? The joy I once felt in hosting had been replaced by a deep sense of resentment, leaving me questioning whether it was even worth continuing this tradition at all. Family gatherings have always been complex, a mix of joy, tradition, and the occasional tension. Hosting Thanksgiving was part of that delicate balance, a chance to bring everyone together despite the quirks and challenges that come with any family dynamic. But this incident felt different. It wasn't a minor misunderstanding or a passing annoyance. It was a breach of trust that made me question the foundation of our relationships. I began to reflect on the dynamics at play. The relative who had taken most of the food wasn't someone I'd ever had a conflict with before. They had always been polite, if not particularly close. Their family, too, had seemed to enjoy our gatherings without causing any issues in the past. That's what made their actions so confusing. Was it thoughtlessness, a lack of awareness, or something more deliberate? I thought about other family members who had attended. Did they notice what was happening? If they had, why hadn't anyone said anything? The more I dwelled on it, the more isolated I felt. This wasn't just about one person's behavior, it was about the silence of everyone else. Surely someone had seen the bags being carried out, yet no one had stepped in to question it or alert us. My husband and I talked about it endlessly, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe they just don't realize how much effort goes into this, he suggested. But even he sounded unconvinced. It wasn't just effort, it was the sheer scale of what had been taken. How could anyone not see that it was too much? The incident began to cast a shadow over my feelings toward the family as a whole. It wasn't just food that had been taken. It was the trust and goodwill that made hosting feel worthwhile. I started to wonder if continuing to host these gatherings was a mistake, one that only invited further disappointment. With Thanksgiving behind us, the next big holiday loomed: Christmas. In our family, it had always been a given that my husband and I would host. The tradition was deeply ingrained, and we took pride in creating a festive, welcoming atmosphere. Yet, after what had happened at Thanksgiving, the thought of hosting Christmas filled me with dread. The idea of opening our home again felt overwhelming. I couldn't shake the memory of the empty fridge, the hours of work that had been wiped away by a single act of thoughtlessness. Hosting Christmas would mean starting the process all over again, planning, cooking, cleaning, all while knowing there was a chance the same thing could happen. The joy I usually felt in preparing for the holidays had been replaced by a gnawing sense of resentment. As December approached, family members began to reach out, casually assuming we would take the lead. "What's the plan for Christmas?" one text read, accompanied by a cheerful holiday emoji. Another message asked what dishes they should bring, a reminder of the desserts that had disappeared untouched just weeks before. Each message felt like a weight pressing down on me, forcing me to confront a decision I wasn't ready to make. I voiced my hesitation to my husband one evening. "I don't know if I can do it this year," I admitted, my voice heavy with frustration. He nodded, understanding my reluctance. "Maybe it's time to set some boundaries," he suggested gently. The idea of stepping back from hosting Christmas was both liberating and guilt-inducing. On one hand, I felt justified after what had happened at Thanksgiving. On the other, I knew it would be met with questions and disappointment. But could I really go through another holiday feeling this way? The answer wasn't clear. Discussing the situation with my husband became inevitable. I needed to know where he stood on the matter, especially since we had always approached hosting as a team. One evening after dinner, I broached the subject. "I'm really not sure about hosting Christmas this year," I said carefully, watching his reaction. He looked up from his plate, a mix of concern and understanding in his eyes. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. What happened at Thanksgiving was unexpected. I felt a surge of relief knowing he shared my feelings. "I just can't go through all that effort again, not when our generosity is taken advantage of," I continued. "It's not about the work, it's about feeling respected." He nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. Maybe it's time we set some boundaries with the family. Hosting shouldn't feel like a burden or a setup for disappointment." We discussed the possibility of talking to the relatives involved, but neither of us felt comfortable initiating that conversation. Confrontation could lead to tension or even conflict, something we wanted to avoid during the holidays. "Perhaps we could suggest that someone else host this year," he suggested. "It might be a good change for everyone." The idea had merit. Passing the torch could relieve us of the immediate pressure while giving us time to reassess how we wanted to handle future gatherings. "But what if no one else steps up?" I wondered aloud. "Then maybe a smaller celebration is in order," he replied. "We can focus on enjoying the holiday without the stress of hosting the entire family." His support meant everything to me. Knowing we were on the same page made the decision feel less daunting. "Thank you for understanding," I said softly. "I was worried you might think I was overreacting." He reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Your feelings are valid. We both want the holidays to be joyful, not stressful." With that, a weight lifted off my shoulders. We had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one, and we would face whatever came next together. With Christmas approaching and the decision to step back from hosting taking shape, I knew I couldn't avoid addressing the situation with my in-laws. They were the family's traditional dessert providers and had always been key contributors to our gatherings. If we weren't hosting, they needed to know, and I suspected they would have their own thoughts about why. One afternoon, I called my mother-in-law. The initial conversation was casual, filled with polite holiday chatter about shopping and decorations. Then, I gently broached the subject. "We've been thinking about taking a break from hosting Christmas this year," I said, trying to keep my tone light. There was a pause. "Oh? Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "It's just that hosting can be overwhelming," I explained carefully. "And after Thanksgiving, we realized we might need to step back and let someone else take the reins for a change." Another pause, this one longer. "Well, I suppose that's understandable," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You two do put in a lot of effort." Encouraged by her response, I continued. "We've loved hosting, but there were some things at Thanksgiving that made us feel like maybe our generosity wasn't being respected." Her voice softened. "I heard about that," she admitted. "I didn't realize the extent of it, but I did see them taking more than their fair share. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Hearing her acknowledgement felt like a small validation. She didn't defend the behavior or dismiss my concerns, which made the conversation feel less daunting. "I think a change might be good for everyone," she added. "Maybe it'll help people appreciate the effort that goes into these gatherings." Her understanding brought a sense of relief. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a step toward feeling less alone in navigating this awkward situation. In the days following my conversation with my mother-in-law, I found myself reflecting on past holiday gatherings. Thanksgiving had always been a highlight, a time when the entire family came together to share food, stories, and laughter. Over the years, these celebrations had developed a rhythm, a predictable pattern of contributions and traditions that made them feel familiar and comforting. But as I thought back, I started noticing small red flags that I'd overlooked at the time. Little moments during previous gatherings began to stand out. Someone loading up an extra plate for later, a tray of desserts vanishing before anyone had a chance to sample it, or casual remarks about how much food there was and how it would go to waste if people didn't take it home. At the time, these incidents had seemed harmless, even amusing. I had chalked them up to quirks of family dynamics. After all, every family has its idiosyncrasies. Now, in the context of what had happened at Thanksgiving, these moments felt less benign. They painted a picture of a pattern, a slow escalation of taking liberties that culminated in the free-for-all I had witnessed, or rather, discovered, this year. It was like a line had been crossed, one that I hadn't even realized existed until it was far behind us. Yet, not all past gatherings carried this weight. There were countless Thanksgivings and Christmases where everything felt balanced, where contributions and gratitude flowed naturally. I thought about the time my sister-in-law had stayed late to help clean up, or the year my father-in-law had brought extra folding chairs to ensure everyone had a seat. Those moments stood in stark contrast to what had happened this year, serving as a reminder of how good it felt when everyone played their part. The comparison made the situation all the more disheartening. Thanksgiving had been a labor of love for so many years, but now it felt tainted by the realization that not everyone valued it in the same way. The thought of hosting again, without addressing these imbalances, seemed impossible. Something would have to change if these gatherings were to regain their former joy. As Christmas drew nearer, I couldn't help but analyze the true cost of hosting these gatherings. The financial burden was the most obvious. Thanksgiving alone had cost hundreds of dollars. Turkeys, a ham, vegetables, ingredients for sides, and drinks all added up quickly. It was an investment we had always been willing to make, but this year it felt different. Knowing how much of that food had been taken without consideration left me questioning whether the expense was worth it. Then there was the time and effort. Cooking a Thanksgiving or Christmas meal was a marathon, one that required days of preparation and left me physically drained. From brining the turkeys to mashing pounds of potatoes, every step was a labor-intensive process. The cleanup was equally taxing, with mountains of dishes and pans to scrub well into the night. Normally, the satisfaction of bringing the family together made it worthwhile. But now, the memory of those empty shelves in the fridge lingered, making the thought of repeating the process feel unbearable. The emotional cost was perhaps the hardest to quantify. Hosting had always brought me joy, a sense of pride in creating a space where everyone felt welcome. This year, that joy had been replaced by resentment and hurt. I found myself questioning whether my efforts were truly appreciated or if I had simply become an easy target for those willing to take advantage. Talking it through with my husband helped clarify things. "It's not just about money or time," I told him one evening. "It's about feeling like my effort means something, like it's respected." He nodded. "And when it's not, it takes away the whole point." That was it. Hosting wasn't just a transaction, it was an act of love. But love, I realized, needed boundaries. Without them, the costs, financial, physical, and emotional, became too high to bear. This year, for the first time, I felt the need to draw a line, even if it meant stepping back from a role I had once cherished. As I replayed the events of Thanksgiving in my mind, one detail continued to gnaw at me: the desserts. My in-laws had brought an impressive array of pies, cookies, and rolls, enough to fill the dessert table twice over. It had always been their way of contributing, and I appreciated it deeply. Yet, by the end of the night, even those desserts had vanished, taken along with the leftovers from the main meal. What struck me as particularly frustrating was the fact that many of these desserts hadn't even been opened. My in-laws' careful preparation and effort, meant to be shared with the family, had been swept up in the same wave of thoughtlessness that had emptied our fridge. The irony was almost too much to bear. These were items they had brought specifically to contribute, and yet someone had decided they were fair game to take without asking. I couldn't help but wonder what my in-laws must have thought when they realized their contributions had disappeared. Did they feel as frustrated as I did? Or had they shrugged it off as part of the chaos of a large family gathering? Part of me wanted to bring it up with them, to find out if they shared my sense of outrage. But another part of me hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject without making things even more uncomfortable. The desserts represented more than just food. They symbolized the collective effort that made these gatherings special. Seeing them treated with such disregard felt like a betrayal, not just to me, but to the spirit of the holiday itself. It was another reminder that what had happened wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a fundamental lack of respect for the time, energy, and love that went into making Thanksgiving a celebration for everyone. Thanksgiving and Christmas have long been more than just holidays. They're cultural cornerstones, imbued with traditions that emphasize generosity, togetherness, and gratitude. Hosting these gatherings felt like an honor, a way of upholding these ideals and creating memories that would last for years. But as I thought about what had unfolded this year, I began to question the unspoken rules and expectations that underpin these celebrations. In our family, hosting was seen as both a responsibility and a privilege. It came with the expectation that the hosts would go above and beyond to provide for everyone. Guests, in turn, were expected to contribute in small but meaningful ways, bringing a dish, offering to help clean up, or simply expressing appreciation. This balance of effort and gratitude was what made the gatherings feel reciprocal and meaningful. Yet this Thanksgiving had highlighted how fragile that balance could be. I couldn't help but wonder if cultural norms had played a role in what happened. In some families, the idea of helping yourself is synonymous with making yourself at home, even if it means taking more than you need. In others, it's understood that certain boundaries shouldn't be crossed, no matter how generous the host may be. Had I unintentionally set a precedent by encouraging people to take leftovers in years past? Or was this simply a case of a few individuals overstepping in a way that went against the values the rest of us held? The social dynamics within our family added another layer of complexity. As the hosts, my husband and I were often viewed as the ones in charge, which sometimes translated to unspoken expectations that we would handle any issues that arose. Yet, confronting family members about their behavior felt fraught with potential for conflict, especially during the holidays. These cultural and social factors didn't excuse what had happened, but they did help me see the situation in a broader context. The breach of trust at Thanksgiving wasn't just about individual actions. It reflected a breakdown in the unspoken agreements that make family gatherings work. Repairing those agreements would require more than just deciding whether or not to host Christmas. It would mean reevaluating the very foundation of how we celebrated as a family. The days leading up to Christmas brought an uncomfortable moral dilemma that I couldn't ignore. On one hand, I felt justified in wanting to step back from hosting. The events of Thanksgiving had left me drained, emotionally, financially, and physically. The idea of repeating that effort without addressing what had happened felt intolerable. Yet, on the other hand, there was the weight of family expectation and tradition. Would choosing not to host make me selfish? Or was it an act of self-preservation? I wrestled with these questions daily, replaying the events of Thanksgiving and imagining how Christmas might unfold. There was a fine line between generosity and enabling, and I wasn't sure which side I'd been standing on all these years. Had my open-handed approach to hosting created an unspoken permission for others to take advantage? If so, where did the responsibility lie? To correct their behavior or to set boundaries that protected my own well-being? The idea of confronting the relatives who had taken the food felt daunting. It wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about preserving the fragile balance that held our family together. A holiday confrontation could lead to tension that lingered far beyond Christmas, affecting relationships in ways I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. Yet staying silent felt like condoning the behavior, leaving me vulnerable to repeat the same experience. Ultimately, the dilemma boiled down to a simple yet profound question. What was more important, honoring the spirit of generosity that had always defined the holidays for me, or protecting my energy and resources in the face of such blatant disrespect? The answer wasn't easy. Every choice seemed to carry potential consequences, both for me and for the family. In the end, I realized that whatever decision I made, it would need to come from a place of honesty, not obligation. In my search for clarity, I decided to share the Thanksgiving story with a few close friends. I wasn't looking for validation so much as perspective, an outside view on what had happened and whether my frustration was warranted. As I recounted the events, from the days of preparation to the shock of the empty fridge, their reactions ranged from sympathetic to outright indignant. "That's unbelievable," one friend exclaimed, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "Who does that, especially to family?" Another friend, known for her pragmatism, took a more measured tone. "It's not uncommon for people to misjudge what's appropriate when leftovers are involved," she offered. "But this goes way beyond that. They knew what they were doing." Hearing their responses was both comforting and unsettling. On one hand, their validation reassured me that my feelings weren't overblown. On the other, it underscored the extent of the breach. It wasn't just my perception. What had happened was objectively out of line. One acquaintance, who had hosted her fair share of family gatherings, offered a cautionary tale. "Something similar happened to me once," she said. "Now I set clear limits. Leftovers go into labeled containers before anyone gets to them, and I decide what goes home with who." The suggestion made sense, but it also felt starkly transactional compared to the open-hearted hosting style I'd always embraced. The idea of policing leftovers at a family gathering seemed so far removed from the warmth and generosity that I associated with the holidays. Still, the conversations helped me see the situation in a new light. My frustration wasn't about the food itself. It was about the disregard for the effort and care that had gone into creating the meal. It wasn't just about them taking leftovers. It was about how their actions had diminished the spirit of the holiday. Knowing that others saw it the same way gave me the confidence to move forward with clearer boundaries, even if it meant changing how I approached hosting in the future. Despite the support and validation from friends, I found myself wrestling with an inner conflict that wouldn't let up. On one side, there was the anger and frustration I felt over what had happened at Thanksgiving, the sense of betrayal, the blatant disregard for my effort, and the emotional exhaustion it had caused. On the other, there was the nagging guilt of stepping back from hosting, a fear that I was letting one incident overshadow years of meaningful family traditions. The truth was, I loved hosting. I loved the process of planning the meal, setting the table, and watching the family come together under our roof. It was my way of expressing love and creating a space where everyone could feel at home. The thought of giving that up felt like losing a piece of myself, a tradition I had cherished and nurtured for years. Yet, after what had happened, the idea of hosting without addressing the underlying issues felt impossible. I began to ask myself deeper questions about what hosting truly meant to me. Was it about the act of giving itself, or the sense of connection and appreciation that came with it? Could I continue to pour my heart into these gatherings if the reciprocity wasn't there? As much as I wanted to brush aside the incident and move forward, I couldn't ignore the way it had changed how I felt about hosting. It wasn't just a logistical issue, it was an emotional one. The warmth and joy I once felt had been replaced by apprehension, and I wasn't sure how to get that back. Ultimately, I realized that my inner conflict wasn't just about Thanksgiving or Christmas. It was about setting boundaries, not only with my family, but with myself. If I continued to give without protecting my own needs, I risked losing the joy that had made hosting so special in the first place. It was a lesson I hadn't anticipated learning, but one I knew I needed to embrace if I wanted to move forward. The idea of addressing the Thanksgiving incident directly with the family lingered in the back of my mind. As uncomfortable as the prospect seemed, I couldn't shake the feeling that avoiding the issue entirely would only lead to further resentment. Still, the thought of a full-blown confrontation made my stomach churn. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to set things right in a way that restored balance without creating more tension. My husband suggested a middle ground, mediation. "What if we bring it up casually, without pointing fingers?" he proposed one evening. "We could frame it as a general conversation about how to make things smoother for everyone moving forward." I mulled over his suggestion. A mediated approach could potentially diffuse the tension, allowing us to address the behavior without singling anyone out. It wasn't about calling out the specific relatives who had taken too much. It was about establishing guidelines that everyone could follow in the future. For instance, we could set a rule that leftovers be divided at the end of the evening, with everyone getting an equal share, rather than leaving it as an open invitation. The idea appealed to me. It felt proactive rather than reactive, a way to take control of the situation without letting it fester. Still, I couldn't ignore the risks. Would the family see this as a reasonable step, or would they perceive it as criticism? And how would we address the elephant in the room? That this was all prompted by the actions of a specific few. In the end, the possibility of mediation felt like the best path forward. It allowed us to maintain the spirit of generosity that defined our gatherings while setting boundaries that protected our efforts. The challenge would be finding the right moment and the right words to make it happen. As Christmas drew closer, the weight of family expectations became harder to ignore. The phone calls and texts continued to roll in, each one carrying an implicit assumption. We would host, as always. "What's on the menu this year?" someone asked, seemingly unaware of the internal turmoil I was facing. "Do you need me to bring an extra dessert?" another offered, as if desserts hadn't already been part of the Thanksgiving fiasco. Each message added to the growing sense of pressure. I knew that breaking from tradition would raise questions, possibly even disappointment. For years, my husband and I had been the family's reliable hosts, the ones who could be counted on to create a holiday experience that everyone looked forward to. Saying no felt like breaking an unspoken contract, one that carried the weight of years of shared memories and collective expectation. At the same time, the thought of hosting under these circumstances felt suffocating. I couldn't imagine standing in the kitchen for hours, pouring my energy into a meal, knowing there was a chance it would be taken for granted, or worse, exploited, once again. The joy I usually felt in preparing for the holidays was overshadowed by a sense of dread, a fear of repeating the same pattern. What made it harder was the lack of clear alternatives. If we didn't host, who would? The family had fallen into a comfortable routine, one that revolved around our willingness to take on the responsibility. Suggesting that someone else host felt like shifting the burden, a move that might be met with resistance or even resentment. As much as I wanted to stand my ground, the pressure to conform was real. The family's expectations weren't malicious. They were rooted in years of tradition and trust. But those expectations came with a cost, one that I wasn't sure I could continue to bear. The question was whether I could find a way to protect my boundaries without disappointing the people I cared about most. After weeks of deliberation, I finally arrived at a decision. I couldn't host Christmas this year. The emotional and physical toll of Thanksgiving, combined with the lingering frustration over what had happened, had made it clear that stepping back was the only way to protect my energy and sanity. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it felt necessary. The next challenge was figuring out how to communicate this to the family. Saying no to hosting wasn't just a logistical shift, it was a break from tradition, one that I knew would raise eyebrows and spark questions. Still, I resolved to be firm yet respectful in my explanation. It wasn't about pointing fingers or laying blame. It was about setting boundaries in a way that felt true to myself. I started with a group text, something simple but clear. "Hi everyone. After a lot of thought, we've decided to take a break from hosting Christmas this year. It's been a wonderful tradition, but we feel it's time for a change. We're happy to contribute to the celebration, and we hope someone else is able to take the lead this time around." The responses were immediate and varied. Some were understanding. "Totally get it. Hosting is a lot of work." Others were curious. "Is everything okay? You guys always do such a great job." A few, as expected, were disappointed. "But Christmas at your place is tradition," one message read, and I could practically hear the hint of guilt in the tone. Despite the mixed reactions, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had put my own needs first. Saying no wasn't easy, but it was liberating. I didn't know what Christmas would look like this year, but I knew it wouldn't come at the expense of my peace. As the days passed, the family's reactions to my decision began to settle in. While most responses to my group message had been polite, if not entirely enthusiastic, a few family members followed up with phone calls to express their thoughts more directly. My mother-in-law was one of the first to call. "I understand where you're coming from," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. "You've hosted so many times, and it's a big responsibility. If anyone deserves a break, it's you two." Her support was a relief, but it wasn't universal. One of my siblings-in-law was less understanding. "It just won't feel the same without Christmas at your place," they said, their tone tinged with disappointment. "Are you sure you can't reconsider? Everyone looks forward to it." I stood firm, explaining that while we loved hosting, it had become overwhelming and we needed time to recharge. "It's not about not wanting to celebrate," I clarified. "We just need to step back this year." Some family members seemed eager to take up the mantle. My sister-in-law, who had always been a great cook, offered to host in our stead. "I'll keep it simple, but I'd love to try it out," she said. Her enthusiasm was genuine, and I felt a flicker of hope that the holiday could still be enjoyable without the weight falling entirely on my shoulders. Others were less enthusiastic about the change, but they accepted it without much argument. The relatives who had been at the center of the Thanksgiving debacle remained notably silent. Whether out of guilt or indifference, they didn't reach out to discuss the decision, leaving me to wonder if they even realized how their actions had contributed to it. Despite the mixed reactions, I felt at peace with my choice. For the first time, I wasn't bending to expectations or sacrificing my well-being for the sake of tradition. The family might not all agree, but I knew I had made the right decision for myself and my husband. Throughout this entire process, my husband had been my anchor. From the moment we discovered the empty fridge after Thanksgiving to the decision to step back from hosting Christmas, he remained calm, supportive, and unwavering in his encouragement. I couldn't have navigated this without him. He had always shared the workload during our holiday gatherings. While I took the lead in planning and cooking, he was the one setting up extra tables, making sure everyone had drinks, and taking care of the dozens of small details that made the day run smoothly. Yet, it was clear that this year's Thanksgiving had affected him as much as it had me. "I know how much hosting means to you," he said one evening as we sat discussing our plans, or lack thereof, for Christmas. "But I've seen how much it's been weighing on you. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. It's okay to take a break." His words were exactly what I needed to hear. I had been carrying so much guilt about stepping back, but his reassurance helped me see the decision in a different light. This wasn't about abandoning tradition or letting anyone down. It was about making a choice that allowed us both to enjoy the holiday in a way that felt manageable and fulfilling. Even as the family reacted to our decision, he stayed by my side, handling the more difficult conversations with tact and patience. When one relative pressed him about why we weren't hosting, he simply said, "It's been a long year, and we need to focus on what feels right for us. We're looking forward to celebrating, but this time, we'll do it differently." His unwavering support made all the difference. Together, we faced the challenges as a team, and for the first time in weeks, I began to feel the weight lifting. This wasn't just my decision, it was ours, and we were stronger for it. Reflecting on the events of the past few weeks, I realized that this experience had taught me more than I could have anticipated. Hosting Thanksgiving and deciding not to host Christmas weren't just isolated events. They were part of a larger journey of understanding my own limits, values, and relationships. One of the biggest lessons was the importance of setting boundaries. For years, I had hosted holiday gatherings without question, believing that the effort and sacrifice were simply part of the tradition. But Thanksgiving had shown me that boundaries are essential, not only for protecting my energy, but also for ensuring that generosity isn't taken for granted. Saying no to hosting Christmas wasn't easy, but it was a necessary step toward reclaiming my sense of balance. I also learned the value of clear communication. While I had hoped that my family would naturally respect the unspoken rules of generosity and moderation, the reality was that those expectations needed to be articulated, whether it was dividing leftovers fairly or setting guidelines for future gatherings. This situation highlighted the need for honesty and transparency in maintaining healthy family dynamics. Another lesson was the power of support. My husband's unwavering encouragement reminded me that I didn't have to navigate this alone. His partnership strengthened my resolve and helped me see that making decisions for our well-being wasn't selfish. It was an act of self-respect. Finally, I came to understand that tradition doesn't have to be rigid. Holidays are about connection, not perfection. By stepping back this year, I created space for others to contribute in new ways, like my sister-in-law stepping up to host. Change doesn't have to mean the end of cherished rituals. It can be an opportunity to adapt and grow. As difficult as the experience had been, I found gratitude in the lessons it brought. The holidays would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. Moving forward, I felt more equipped to create celebrations that honored both my family and myself. This year, the biggest gift I could give was the courage to embrace change. With the decision to step back from hosting Christmas finalized, my husband and I began brainstorming what the holiday might look like this year. For so long, Christmas had been tied to the idea of a large gathering, filled with bustling energy and endless to-do lists. But this year offered an unexpected opportunity to redefine how we celebrated, on our own terms. We started by asking ourselves what truly mattered most about the holiday. Was it the elaborate meals and perfectly decorated tables? Or was it the time spent together, the moments of reflection, and the sense of peace that often got lost in the chaos of hosting? The answer became clear. Simplicity and connection were at the heart of what we wanted Christmas to be. One idea was to have a quiet, intimate holiday with just the two of us. We envisioned a day filled with our favorite traditions, watching classic holiday movies, cooking a small but special meal, and exchanging meaningful gifts. It was a stark contrast to the usual frenetic pace of hosting, but the thought of it brought a sense of calm and excitement. Another option we discussed was traveling. Instead of staying home and navigating family dynamics, we could escape to a cozy cabin or explore a new city. The idea of experiencing Christmas in a completely different setting felt liberating, almost like pressing a reset button on how we approach the holiday. We also considered organizing a small gathering with close friends or hosting a post-Christmas brunch, allowing us to celebrate on a smaller scale without the pressure of being the centerpiece of the holiday. Whatever we decided, the focus would be on creating a celebration that felt authentic and fulfilling. This Christmas would be a break from tradition, but not from the spirit of the season. Instead, it was a chance to embrace what truly brought us joy. As Christmas drew closer and the new plans began to take shape, I couldn't help but think about how this decision might ripple through our family dynamics in the long term. Stepping back from hosting wasn't just about this year. It was a change that could reshape how we approach the holidays moving forward. Would others in the family step up to fill the role we had occupied for so long? Or would the absence of our gatherings highlight deeper tensions and imbalances? For years, my husband and I had been the reliable hosts, the ones who could be counted on to bring everyone together. Changing that dynamic felt like shifting the foundation of our family traditions. In the short term, it had sparked a mix of understanding and disappointment. But what about the years to come? Would this become an opportunity for others to share in the responsibility? Or would it leave a gap that no one was willing to fill? I also wondered how this shift might affect our relationships with individual family members. Some, like my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, had shown genuine support and even enthusiasm for the change. Their understanding felt like a bridge, a way to keep the bonds strong despite the change in tradition. Others, however, had been more resistant, their disappointment hinting at unspoken expectations that we might not meet again. Then there were the relatives whose actions had sparked this entire situation. Their silence since Thanksgiving suggested either a lack of awareness or an unwillingness to address what had happened. I didn't know whether to expect an apology, a confrontation, or simply a quiet return to status quo. Regardless, their behavior had left a mark that would take time and effort to heal. Ultimately, this year's decision felt like a turning point. It was a chance to reassess not just our role in the family, but also the dynamics that defined our relationships. While the future was uncertain, I felt more confident in our ability to navigate it with honesty, fairness, and a renewed sense of boundaries. As Christmas Day approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. What started as a seemingly small act of frustration, a reaction to the events of Thanksgiving, had evolved into a profound lesson about boundaries, respect, and the true meaning of the holidays. The experience had challenged me in ways I hadn't expected, but it had also left me with a clearer understanding of what I valued most. At its core, this story wasn't just about food or hosting. It was about generosity and the fine line between giving freely and being taken for granted. It was about the balance that makes family gatherings work, the unspoken agreements that everyone contributes and respects each other's efforts. When those agreements are broken, it's not just the logistics that suffer, it's the trust and connection that make the holidays meaningful. The decision to step back from hosting wasn't an easy one, but it was necessary. It allowed me to prioritize my well-being and reframe how I approached the holidays. This year, Christmas would be quieter and more intentional, focused on what truly mattered. Quality time with my husband, a sense of peace, and the freedom to celebrate in a way that felt authentic to us. The support I received from some family members reinforced the importance of communication and honesty. At the same time, the silence from others served as a reminder that not every relationship can, or should, be maintained without boundaries. Moving forward, I felt more confident in my ability to set those boundaries while still embracing the spirit of generosity that had always defined my approach to hosting. In the end, the moral of the story was simple. Giving doesn't have to mean sacrificing yourself. True hospitality is about creating connection and joy, not at the expense of your own, but in harmony with it. This Christmas, the greatest gift I could give was the courage to honor that truth and let it guide how I celebrated, not just this year, but for years to come.